The biggest fraud scandal in Minnesota history is exploding even further, and now the people at the center of it are finally facing serious consequences. Federal investigators are uncovering massive schemes that allegedly stole hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars through programs that were originally meant to help struggling families, hungry children, and vulnerable communities during the pandemic. And now, one of the main figures behind it all has just been sentenced to more than 4 decades in prison. A Minnesota judge has sentenced Amy Bach, the alleged mastermind behind the Feeding Our Future scandal, to more than 41 years behind bars. Prosecutors say she helped orchestrate a massive operation that billed the government for meals that were never actually served to children during the pandemic. The court also ordered her to pay back an astonishing $243 million in restitution, after investigators concluded that taxpayers were scammed on a massive scale. Before sentencing, Bach reportedly broke down in tears inside the courtroom while standing there in shackles. She admitted that she failed the public, her family, and everyone around her. But despite the conviction, she also claims she's being turned into the face of the entire scandal, while many others connected to the scheme continue avoiding the spotlight and, according to critics, possibly avoiding accountability altogether. Federal officials say the Feeding Our Future scandal is only one piece of a much larger web of fraud that's spread across Minnesota programs. The Department of Justice recently announced charges against 15 more individuals tied to separate Medicaid fraud operations. Authorities claim these schemes abused programs designed to help autistic children, homeless families, and low-income residents who desperately needed assistance. Investigators say some of these programs exploded in size almost overnight. One autism treatment initiative reportedly grew from a modest budget of around $600,000 into a staggering $400 million operation. Prosecutors allege that fraudulent centers encouraged parents to seek questionable autism diagnoses for children so operators could bill taxpayers for treatments that were never necessary in the first place. And according to investigators, the damage didn't stop there. Officials say the abuse became so severe that some of these public programs were eventually shut down entirely. That means families who genuinely depended on these services suddenly lost access because scammers allegedly treated government programs like personal piggy banks. Another major program under scrutiny is Minnesota's Housing Stabilization Initiative. What reportedly started as a $2.5 million program exploded into more than $100 million before authorities stepped in. Prosecutors claim fraudsters manipulated the system to siphon huge amounts of taxpayer money, while people who truly needed housing assistance were left behind. Federal prosecutors are now warning that many suspects connected to these schemes are still out there. One Justice Department official issued a chilling warning directly aimed at fraudsters still enjoying their freedom, telling them to eat, drink, and be merry, because their days are numbered. Authorities insist this investigation is far from over, and more arrests are likely coming. The Feeding Our Future case alone has already led to dozens of criminal charges. Prosecutors say nearly 80 people were charged in connection to the operation, with more than 60 convictions already secured. Investigators believe fake invoices, shell companies, and fabricated meal counts were used to steal enormous amounts of pandemic relief money while the country was in crisis. But now the controversy is becoming even more political, because Amy Bach and others connected to the scandal are raising questions about Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Bach recently claimed she struggles to believe Omar didn't know what was happening in her own district while these fraud operations were allegedly taking place all around her.
Congresswoman Omar has strongly denied any wrongdoing and insists she had no knowledge of the fraud schemes. She has repeatedly called the allegations against her completely false and says critics are pushing conspiracy theories without evidence. Omar also argues that accusations against her are motivated by racism, xenophobia, and political attacks rather than legitimate facts. Still, critics continue pointing to photographs, campaign appearances, and public events involving restaurants and organizations later tied to the investigation. Some commentators claim it is impossible for such large-scale fraud to happen within such a concentrated area without local political leaders becoming aware of it at some level.
One investigator involved in publicly discussing the scandal argued that many of the fraud sites operated within only a few miles of Omar's district offices. According to critics, the sheer concentration of activity makes it difficult for them to believe local leaders were completely unaware of what investigators now describe as one of the largest fraud operations in state history. At the same time, supporters of Omar argue there is still no direct proof tying her to any criminal activity. They point out that investigations into her finances and political activities have gone on for years without resulting in criminal charges. Omar's defenders say opponents are simply trying to connect her to unrelated crimes because of her high-profile political status. But questions intensified after scrutiny emerged over Omar's financial disclosure forms. Reports surfaced claiming her reported family net worth dramatically changed between filings, leading to accusations of inconsistencies and calls for further investigation. Omar later stated that the discrepancy was caused by accounting mistakes involving liabilities connected to her husband's business. Critics remain skeptical, saying the numbers simply do not add up. Some Republicans in Minnesota have demanded deeper investigations into whether financial disclosures were properly reported and whether any connections exist between political fundraising networks and organizations tied to fraud allegations. The controversy deepened further after reports that House Republicans attempted to investigate Feeding Our Future and subpoena documents connected to the case. Critics claim Democrats blocked some efforts to force cooperation, fueling accusations that political protection may be occurring behind the scenes. Meanwhile, federal authorities continue arresting additional suspects tied to broader Medicaid fraud schemes. Prosecutors recently highlighted cases involving fraudulent autism treatment claims worth tens of millions of dollars. Investigators allege some operators billed Medicaid for services that were either unnecessary, exaggerated, or never provided at all. One defendant allegedly attempted to flee authorities after being accused of millions in Medicaid fraud. Others are accused of exploiting childcare programs and food assistance initiatives that were supposed to benefit struggling children during the pandemic. Prosecutors say these fraud schemes stretched across multiple state-managed aid programs. Federal officials are now calling this the largest autism fraud bust in American history. They argue that criminals exploited emergency pandemic programs because safeguards were weakened during the rush to distribute aid quickly to families in need. Investigators say that lack of oversight opened the door for large-scale abuse. Critics of the system argue this reveals a much deeper problem with how emergency government programs are managed. They claim weak oversight, loose regulations, and rushed spending created perfect conditions for organized fraud rings to thrive, while taxpayers unknowingly funded lavish lifestyles, luxury purchases, and expensive vacations. Supporters of tougher enforcement believe the recent arrests could finally create a major deterrent. They argue that fraud becomes rampant when criminals believe nobody will investigate them or hold them accountable. Now that prison sentences are becoming severe and investigations are expanding, officials hope others thinking about similar crimes will reconsider. Some analysts believe this may only be the beginning. In large federal investigations involving many defendants, prosecutors often rely heavily on cooperation agreements. That means people already charged may provide information on additional suspects, potentially expanding the investigation far beyond the individuals currently in custody. The scandal has also reignited debate about whether politicians ignored warning signs because these programs benefited politically connected communities. Critics argue some leaders may have turned a blind eye because the organizations receiving money were influential within local political networks and campaign circles. Others counter that many public officials were simply overwhelmed during the pandemic and failed to recognize how quickly fraud was spreading. They argue that emergency programs were created rapidly during a national crisis and that criminals exploited chaos rather than political favoritism. Still, the sheer scale of the alleged theft has shocked many Americans. Billions in taxpayer dollars were distributed nationwide during the pandemic, and Minnesota's cases are now being held up as one of the clearest examples of how weak oversight can lead to massive abuse of public funds. Now, the big question is whether more political figures, organizers, or connected individuals will eventually face charges as investigations continue expanding. Federal prosecutors insist they are still uncovering new evidence and following every lead connected to these fraud networks. And as more defendants cooperate, more documents emerge, and more financial records are examined, this scandal may continue growing far beyond what the public has already seen. Whether this becomes remembered as a story of corruption, negligence, political protection, or systemic failure, one thing is certain. investigators say they are nowhere near finished uncovering the truth.